In this interview, we hear from Becky, a 31-year-old clinical psychology PhD candidate living in Maryland who shares her career and education experience from her undergraduate years through to present day. Let's get started. Hi, Becky. Thank you so much for joining me today. I cannot wait to hear in detail about your career and education journey in clinical psychology. So thank you for joining me.
Of course.
I guess right off the bat, let's start at undergrad. What interested you in the degrees that you pursued, and how did that evolve into now pursuing your PhD in clinical psychology?
I could say I could pinpoint my interest in psychology specifically to some family friends that live out in Indiana. One is a professor, or was, he's now retired, at University of Notre Dame, and the other was a clinical psychologist. So as a married couple, they were lively and hilarious and exposed me to the topic in a really wonderful way. From there, that was when I was in high school. I went on to pursue an undergraduate degree at Loyola in psychology. That was not necessarily a straight path, in that I initially thought that I wanted a teaching degree as well as a psych degree, but I also really enjoyed Spanish. So to be honest, I kind of fumbled my way through what was going on and what I enjoyed. And from some great advice from a really wonderful advisor and professor, I was able to put things together and decide teaching was not maybe for me. Um, and instead pursue a bachelor's degree in psychology and Spanish as a double major. And then from there, I applied my senior year of college actually to doctoral programs, and I was not accepted. And at the time, it certainly felt like the end of the world. As a senior in college, I think there are a number of people that have the next phase of their life somewhat lined up. And there's a lot of peer comparison happening. So I was definitely worried about what my next step was going to be. After some really wonderful time applying to jobs, as we all love to do, I actually found a research job and ended up staying in the Baltimore area. So I worked for University of Maryland in their school mental health National Center for School Mental Health is now what it's called, on a number of different research projects, broad topics including peer work for people with substance use issues, as well as suicidal ideation interventions for children and teens in school settings, and just a broad variety of topics that were both direct intervention projects as well as evaluation projects. So looking at how well someone else's intervention went. From there, I again applied to doctoral programs. I wasn't interested in pursuing a separate master's degree due to the number of educational years. I thought one shot and I'm done would be a preference for me. And so that's what I did. I was successful in that first round of applying. Leading up to applying to doctoral programs in psychology, there are a number of different thought processes on what type of degree to pursue. I landed in a PhD, or I ended up pursuing, I should say, a PhD. It wasn't unintentional. And I have been doing really incredible work at the Catholic University of America in my PhD program for clinical psychology. What happens for this specific program, a lot of programs vary a lot, is that you receive a master's degree on the way to your PhD. So I actually hold a master's of arts in clinical psych right now, and will eventually have a PhD in clinical psych with a concentration in children, families, and cultures.
It's amazing. Thank you so much for emphasizing and sharing that particular undergrad years where you didn't quite think that reality met with your expectations, because I can just imagine that what you ended up doing working in research just informed so much more what you wanted to pursue when you did end up in a PhD program. Do you feel like that was the case? Did it steer you maybe from being interested in working with a certain demographic that you originally thought you would like to work with to a different one, or what was that like?
Those 3 years were incredibly fruitful, and I really enjoyed everything I did. As a motto sort of throughout life, I'm someone who appreciates experience, whether I find out something I want to do or I rule out something I don't.
Yeah.
And those 3 years were really helpful in doing that. I very much so enjoyed the work with and around kids. So adolescents and younger were really fun projects. I was much more motivated with them. Working with adults was interesting, and I appreciated the opportunities that I had in research projects about adults. Um, but I certainly didn't have as much energy from working on them or feel like they were what I wanted to do moving forward. Overall, I also really benefited from the fact that I worked for 3 years before I went on to my PhD program because it I think the most important thing going in to know is that it can be really financially challenging. And there are a lot of reasons that people don't decide on receiving a doctorate, whether it be a PsyD or a PhD. But funding, I think, is one of the biggest barriers to entry for a lot of folks. So definitely having that time to make some money, save some money, and prepare for that next step was really helpful. And along the way, I worked with a very large faculty of psychologists who were able to offer advice. And then they actually hosted interns. So your final year of your doctoral program in clinical psych is what's called an internship. And I was able to receive advice and insight from them as well, before even applying to the programs.
Yeah, that's incredible. I think something I've noticed now that all of my siblings and my cousins are at the tail end of like the college era is that going right into the workforce before pursuing additional degrees has invaluable just life skills experience, as you touched upon. Being able to succinctly answer emails or just learn how learning to adult is really valuable before often going into those programs. So it sounds like everything worked out for the best on that front. So obviously, as has been touched upon, a PhD program, it is an extensive length of time to pursue a PhD program. So can you tell me a little bit about what that's been like for you now that you're nearing the tail end, in terms of, just life goes on, hitting life events, managing schoolwork and working, all that stuff.
Yeah, so different doctoral programs are going to take different lengths of time. That's one of the statistics actually that the APA publishes about different accredited programs is what is the average length of time that a student takes to complete this degree, which I encourage anyone interested in applying to those programs to look at, because there are trends with some programs taking closer to 8 years or 7 years, and some programs taking closer to 5 years. And then, of course, a broad spread in between. For clinical psychology, there are a number of requirements to complete. My program started heavily with a number of courses. So it almost felt like going back to undergrad, where 5 days a week you're going to class, you are with your little group of students that you came in with. We were also overlapped with master's level students in some of our courses. And there's homework and there's, papers and there's all sorts of those things that I got a little break from. And so that is certainly challenging. But basically what happens each year is that the challenge changes. So you're talking about pulling in your personal life. I was in a really beautiful place when I started the doctoral program that I didn't have a lot of responsibilities. I was able to really make this my top priority, spend a lot of intense time engaging in it, and schedule my other things around that. I will say the number of years that I've been in the program, things have shifted. And my personal life has gotten a little bit busier. I was in the program with other people who were parents who had aging parents of their own that they were caring for. So there are certainly people who go through these programs and are able to balance sets of responsibilities, but it does become more challenging as you add more responsibilities to your life for other priorities. Eventually it does, being in a program, at least for me, for an extended period of time, meant that I'm ready for the next thing. I'm ready to close out this chapter, finish up my degree, and move on with my career and, you know, shift gears in my personal life. So I think that's the way I've experienced it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And is there a dream or set of dream scenarios that come after completing the program? Like specifically, again, working with a target demographic or particular disorders?
Yeah, so a bulk of my work has been in early childhood. So depending on where you are, that definition is going to vary, whether it be 0 to 6 or 2 to 7. But I very much so enjoy doing early childhood work. A lot of it also is with parents, of course, because when you're working with a 2 or 3 year olds, they're not necessarily going to be the ones
Yeah.
that you are teaching, especially complex concepts to in therapy. You're going to be working a lot with the parent and the environment, and I enjoyed that a lot. The other thing that I have had the opportunity to experience a couple times in clinical work is integrated primary care. So for that, it's happening more at academic medical centers, but it's where pediatricians are at least co-located with psychologists. And when there is any type of behavioral concern that comes up in a pediatric visit, tantrums, hitting, kicking, spitting, the whole gamut of what could possibly going on, including any sorts of worries or attention concerns. Those pediatricians have 15, maybe 20 minutes for those visits. And it can be really challenging to get to all of the physical health concerns as well as any behavioral health concerns that might be coming up for a family. So that's where the psychology team is able to step in, and they do usually, if they're able to, what's called a warm handoff, meaning they might meet the family in the exam room and say, hey, this is who we are, this is what we do, and then try to see if the family's interested in scheduling an appointment to talk about those behavioral health concerns separately. If possible, they also try to pull them in same day and just have a conversation about those behavioral health concerns there and then. So really love both of those things. When it comes to diagnoses, I don't know that I'm not someone who has always been super passionate about a single diagnosis, where you might see people who work with individuals diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. They might say, that I have a high amount of interest in that. I haven't found that to be the case for myself. I've worked a lot with anxiety, depression, and just recently I've been doing a rotation in a trauma clinic. So especially as someone who speaks Spanish, it is really beneficial to be able to have the ability to work across a broad spectrum of diagnoses. And so I think I found that valuable.
That's amazing. Yay. I'm so happy for you on a personal level. Um, maybe not something fun to discuss, but my understanding, having not gone through a PhD program myself, is that typically there's this little thing called a dissertation.
Mhm.
What's your experience been like with that process?
It can be interesting. So first, all doctoral programs, if you don't come in with a master's degree, you're going to have to obtain a master's on your way. So you're going to first write that thesis just like any other master's student would. So you get sort of a little bit of baby exposure to the process through that master's thesis, depending on your program's approach to that. My program's approach was a little bit more of a paper that you had to hand in because there are so many other phases of research, and there's comprehensive exams that we go through. There's a lot of different stages of challenges. So from that, some doctoral students go on to sort of broaden that research and use that as a jumping off point. I am doing something similar to that in that I am taking an idea that I had for my master's thesis that was a little bit too complicated, and the data set wasn't quite ready yet. So I'm pulling that into my PhD, or sorry, my dissertation, I should say. And the best way I can say is that the process is a good challenge for anyone who finds time management tricky. It is this big amorphous project with very few actual deadlines. So you could extend it for a very long time. And I've known a few people who have done that. They haven't enjoyed that, but they have unintentionally done that. So just really keeping yourself to those official deadlines can be really helpful. And then from there, I think one of the biggest challenges with dissertation for me has been keeping myself to those unofficial deadlines of keeping progress going on it. I'm in a very lucky position that the data I'm using is already collected. So depending on if you have to collect data or not, that can also be a really tricky step. Because post-COVID, it has been more challenging. I've heard from my sort of cohort as well as other individuals in the psychology department that it's been more challenging to get people in, especially if you have to do something in person.
Gotcha. And another element, I feel like we backtracked. We got to the end, and now I'm like, okay, itty bitty pieces of the program along the way. I know that you were student teaching for a bit there. Did you enjoy that element of the program? Was it helpful for you? Like, did you refresh your knowledge of certain topics by doing that? If you can go into that process.
Yeah, so that has to do with funding. So I'm going to back us up a little bit further and talk about doctoral programs. So doctoral programs overall in psychology are two major branches. One is the PsyD, the other is a PhD. Lots of people will tell you lots of different things about how to differentiate the two. The thing that I have found most true is that most often you're going to find more funding in a PhD program, meaning money to live on, a stipend, something like that, whether it has to do with tuition support, that kind of thing, rather than in a PsyD program. Otherwise, it's pretty similar. PsyD programs are a little bit more geared toward pure clinical work, and they have a reduced emphasis on research. But for PhD programs, those big research projects are what pull in the money to be able to support students. So it's a little bit of that catch-22 in differentiating the two. But going from there, we were talking about sort of what the process of that student teaching as well as advising might go through. For different students, they might have different responsibilities. So from there, I sort of fork it and say, there are research responsibilities and there are teaching responsibilities. So depending on the research lab that you're in, which when you apply for a doctorate, you're applying directly to an advisor, and each advisor has their own research lab. Sometimes when you go in, an advisor has a brand new research project and they need a research assistant. So you can be pulled in and funded that way. Very often departments rely heavily on their graduate students to do either TA work, which is teaching assistant work, or at Catholic, they call it TF work. And so TFs would be the individuals who actually teach the class. coming up with the lesson plans, executing them, that kind of thing. But yeah, so I've done some teaching of my own classes. I've done some guest lecturing in other people's courses, as well as I guest lectured at Loyola for a class. And it just really depends on the structure of your program, but I've enjoyed that aspect of it.
Now that you're almost there, almost at that finish line, is there anything you had wished you had known about pursuing a doctorate program prior to starting it, or had been more prepared for?
The answer that comes to mind foremost is no. And to explain that, I have to caveat that I am someone who really appreciates and seeks out the wisdom of others. I asked everyone and anyone who said, if there's anything I can do to help, please just let me know. I would ask them, try not to pester them too much, but ask them a handful of questions, or even just some reflective questions like you asked me. If there's one thing, you wish you knew, or if there's one thing you would have changed, what might it have been? And there was a lot of insightful pieces of wisdom that came out of those questions. And it was really wonderful to be able to ask people not on an interview, because anytime you're going to go for an interview for anything, you're going to hear the positives. And asking people outside of that context, I really got some of the realness of it. It's hard, it's challenging, you're tired, you don't want to do it sometimes. I think the biggest thing for me that I keep reminding myself right now is your dissertation is not the end all be all of your research work. It is, something that you need to do. It has to be of a certain quality and caliber, but you don't need to get stuck on it being this perfect project. And I think that has been really wonderful for me to know most of what's going into things before I do it. Now, there are stages of the process, so you can't know everything before you do it.
Yeah.
But I have continued that effort of engaging others on various upcoming topics. For me, next is getting licensed, doing a postdoctoral fellowship, and I've had the opportunity to ask people about that, who are either in that process or who have been recently in that process. And that's always been really helpful.
So, bringing things to a close, hopefully a nice transition, do you have any words of wisdom or encouragement for anyone who is potentially interested in starting a journey which you're almost done with?
Yeah. One of the biggest reflections in this program that I actually talked to a faculty member about, and she somewhat agreed with, was that getting a PhD doesn't necessarily, or a doctoral degree, I think overall, doesn't necessarily mean you're smarter or better than somebody who got a master's degree. It really does have to do with your motivation and your mental endurance. It is a longer period of time. It is more work. And it is going to be frustrating and challenging, and being able to continue through those difficult times. I would be lying to say that I haven't shed a tear during this time. And so I think anyone who feels like they aren't wise enough or intelligent enough to pursue a doctoral degree, I would challenge them to say that they probably are. It's just whether or not they are willing to make certain sacrifices and endure the longer period of time. And on the other end of things, if you think you have to get a doctorate, no, you don't. That's really the most succinct advice I could give. You, especially in psychology, you can pursue fields with a master's degree or work with a master's degree that psychologists with a PhD are engaging in without really much of an issue. So the process is certainly different, and there are certain things that master's level clinicians don't necessarily engage in, but for the most part, you could do the same thing. So just really discerning what level of mental fortitude you have for that continued schoolwork, research work, as well as when you add in that clinical work, that ability to balance your time and manage those deadlines. I think that's the overall most important.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your encouragement and words of wisdom. I really appreciate your time today. And I simply cannot wait to celebrate when you graduate.
Thank you. I'm excited for it too.